Powerpuff Girls, apparently a trans episode, the 2016 revival series, because executives don't have an original bone in their body and we will drown in nostalgia till we die. Boom. World's quickest introduction right there. Either you're hooked or you've already left. And I do think this is something worth talking about, because this series came out right around the time we were hitting the big trans wave that presumably filtered into places like children's media. Stuff like Steven Universe, and would influence other later shows like Owl House, She-Ra, and Amphibia. And so, because Steven Universe has been done to death and I refuse to ever touch that show and the frankly painful discourse around it, instead, we're going to discuss Powerpuff Girls, and the impact that it might have had with its Season 1 Episode 5, Horn Sweet Horn, as well as, some other stuff that was kind of written into even the original series. Let's get on with it. Also, before anyone asks, yes, that is the best drawing I could possibly do, and that took about 20 to 30 minutes, with aid. I'm bad. I'm a bad artist. Now, the episode begins with the Powerpuff Girls at the zoo, on a school trip. And there is a strange bit at the start about this zookeeper guy who tells the kids not to kiss pythons because they might end up like him, and who was thinking about kissing pythons? Was this a serious concern that he needed to allay due to the frequency with which zoo visitors end up attempting to make out with the resident snakes, only to get devoured or fucked up by them? Or is this just one zookeeper's desperate attempt to impress his own desires upon others by acting as if they are normal or regular way that people engage with slithering little friends?
That is why you should not try to kiss a giant python. Oh boy.
I don't know, and I think that the fact my brain got stuck on that and refused to let me go is probably the continued sign that stuff up there is a little bit odd, and will not let me just watch things without questioning every intimate detail about them. Anyways, the Powerpuff Girls are at a zoo, and Bubbles is obsessed with the idea of unicorns and wants to meet them, to which she gets mocked by the rest of the class for her belief in that silly notion, even though she apparently has a totally real-life unicorn horn that can summon the creatures to her side.
A real-life unicorn horn! Totally real unicorn horn!
No answers on where the fuck she pulled this kazoo from that allows her to pull something like that off, but everyone laughs at her more for that, and then some nasally sounding kid tells her that only Sasquatch is real before the teacher finally decides to step in and move this rapidly getting off topic class visit and kind of turning into just a bullying trip towards a far more sensible option, like the gift shop.
Alrighty, who wants to go to the gift shop?
Also, quick note here, is it weird to these kids that unicorns might be real? They have magic-powered girls in their class that were created in a test tube, like who have literal magical abilities. Is that not wild enough to make you think that maybe other stuff exists out there?
Sugar, spice, and everything nice. Who would have guessed that's what little girls were actually made of?
Yeah! Thanks, Professor!
Bubbles doesn't go with the rest of them, though, disheartened by the cruelty and disbelief of her classmates in something that she holds dearly. A truth that only she seems to want to accept. Though of course, all of the audience knows that it's a silly belief because unicorns died out many centuries ago, and the evidence is clear from their nesting sites under North Korea.
Out of North Korea, the state news agency there claims that archaeologists have just located an ancient unicorn lair.
Yeah, remember that? Remember that time when a bunch of English journalists poorly translated a North Korean site that discussed the discovery of a location named Kiringol, or the lair of the Kirin, as if North Korea was just doing some wacky propaganda stuff again, when in reality it was just that they found a place that was named that, like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. Doesn't mean that the Irish are claiming that giants are real if they use that name for it, but us Western people are very open to accepting any silly story about North Korea as real because our sense of that country has been warped by decades of outside perceptions that allow anything said about it to be possibly true. How did we get to North Korea? I thought we were talking about a children's animated show. Oh yeah, Powerpuff Girls. So Bubbles begins to doubt her own beliefs because of the power of peer pressure before a unicorn magically appears from some bushes, and Bubbles finally realizes that no, it was totally true all along. The other Powerpuff Girls see this unicorn and, however, get that its horn is made of wood and attached to its hair, and when they knock off this unicorn's horn, the horse gets incensed and stands up on two legs and begins having a go at them for hurting its feelings by denying what it feels like it should be.
Well, excuse me! I may not have a horn, but I do have a heart! And in that heart, I know I'm a beautiful unicorn!
Appropriately, the Powerpuff Girls are more shocked by the fact that this horse can speak, because that is legitimately impressive, and perhaps should be the indicator of some other shit going on here. But Bubbles tells Donnie, as we discover is the horse's name, that she will get the professor to turn him into a real unicorn, so it won't be a wannabe corn anymore, his own words for it.
I'll never be anything more than just Donnie, the wannabe corn.
Now, while for Donnie, this might be a case of him realising his own ambitions for what he feels in his heart that he is, Bubbles is approaching this whole thing not from the perspective of trying to help Donnie for his sake, but because she wants to be friends with a unicorn, and proving that they're real will help her shove it in the faces of those that mocked her, which is, gender politically, a weird message. Also, Pickle Museum.
Here we have the world's oldest pickle. And this is a pickle made entirely of used toothpick.
Don't ask me why this matters, but I'm sure that the Pickle Museum will be an essential part of the plot at some point. The professor then tells Bubbles and Donnie that he has a tool that could do the job, but he just made it and hasn't tested it, and his whole thing is sort of dodgy science. And Bubbles tells the professor that she needs this to happen, that this is essential, and Donnie goes along with the plan because he trusts Bubbles, who, as we have covered, is using less than honest reasons to want to help Donnie here. The professor then floods Donnie with a bunch of options from a document that tells him all of the potential issues with the procedure, which Donnie, as a child, doesn't read it all or bother thinking about, and then just signs immediately.
As you read through this document in its entirety,
I skimmed it.
A signature necessity that tells me the professor has done this enough times that he needs to get the signature of people that he fucks with so that he can then use it in court to prove that he's not liable for anything that went wrong in his crazy science experiments. Which is a horrifying perspective, really. And already, I think you can begin to see the massive cracks appearing in this episode if it was intended to be a trans allegory. Like, the best thing for this episode at this point would be for it to reveal that it totally isn't a trans episode, and that this is just about unicorns, okay? A possible option that I will be shooting down in this video, so, you know, spoilers there, I guess. The device then turns Donnie into a monster, and he blames Bubbles for it because she was the one he trusted for the procedure, and then he proceeds to freak out and run out of the lab into the night, while screaming about how he hates science now.
No! I hate science!
There's something just very wrong about this episode that keeps getting more and more distasteful. Donnie then runs in front of the Pickle Museum. Ah, the Pickle Museum, it all comes together now.
Hey, what is that?
And a bunch of people begin taking pictures of him, seeming to be intrigued and shocked by this monstrous-looking creature. A thing that ends up making Donnie transform again into more of a monster, and he then bursts into the Pickle Museum, gets called a freak by a bunch more people, attempts to kill them, and kidnaps the mayor.
I am not a freak!
All reasonable responses here from a little child who went through a completely illegal medical procedure that they didn't really understand or properly consent to, that has then led to them being perceived by society as something wrong or freakish. Bubbles then tries to get Donnie to calm down before he loses it at her and runs away, which is honestly, yet again, another perfectly moderate response here, because she did push him into a terrible decision with her desire for a unicorn friend. Something which she acknowledges in her attempt to relate to Donnie, to get him to stop his rampage.
I put you in danger just because I wanted to be friends with a unicorn and prove to everyone that they were real.
Well, they're not real.
Though all it does is make him completely abandon his beliefs in his unicorn self and say that they were both very wrong and that such a thing is impossible, becoming more monstrous as he does so. Bubbles then blows the kazoo more, while convincing Donnie that in his heart he knows he is a unicorn, which he denies as in his heart he is a monster now. And then he hits Bubbles and destroys her kazoo.
No, in my heart I know I'm a monster.
And that gives him a small moment of regret, which leads to him falling off the fucking building. These are quite short episodes, so if it seems like I'm really running through this at a fast pace, it's because things are happening in them at a fast fucking pace. You've got to try and keep up. They then think that Donnie is dead, because of the whole, well, falling off a building thing, before he rises up in glowing light, lifted by the magical power of real unicorns, who also transform him into a horse again. Donnie and Bubbles then reconcile, with Bubbles apologising again, and Donnie also saying sorry because Bubbles only wanted what was best for him.
I'm sorry too, Bubbles. I blamed you, but heck, I didn't think about the consequences either.
Which totally isn't true. She very evidently wanted what was best for her and viewed Donnie as a means of obtaining that thing. Donnie should maybe apologise for hitting her and destroying her kazoo, but the horrific science disaster shit is all Bubbles and the Professor's fault.
But it hasn't been properly tested.
Professor, he needs this. I need this.
Bubbles for pushing, and the Professor for just allowing that to happen. Though the Professor is a mad scientist with zero care for the impact of said science, and that makes him honestly closer to a Spider-Man villain than anything else.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Donnie then says how he just wanted to be a unicorn so badly, and Bubbles tells him that he always has been a unicorn, which seems to annoy him with the way that this keeps getting said, but isn't the real physical truth according to him. It's just a metaphorically speaking thing, and metaphorically speaking can go kiss its own ass.
Okay, Bubbles, I get the sentiment, but honestly, this is getting kind of redundant.
But then the unicorns reveal that Donnie is actually totally, really a unicorn, and that he had to pass an intense adolescent moment of discovery to be able to find out that truth. He literally has a horn, and he just couldn't see it because of his mop of hair over it. And then Donnie flies away with the other unicorns, after giving Bubbles a new unicorn kazoo that would allow her to summon him at any time.
It's beautiful.
And the episode ends with the Unicorn Coalition Alliance Brigade headquarters, or UCAB, yeah, not quite as catchy as LGBTQ, saving the day and fixing the city up. And that's the episode.
And so the day was saved, thanks to
The Unicorn Coalition Alliance Brigade Headquarters.
So there is a fair bit to take from this episode, to attempt to break down here, before we move on to discussing the older and more consistent elements of queerness and transness that existed in previous Powerpuff Girls. And I want to start by trying to confirm if this episode is a transgender one at all. While there is certainly some allegory there if you are looking for it, there's no definitive mentions of trans people. There are no trans people involved in the writing, the directing, the casting, or any of it that I can find from digging into LinkedIn profiles and IMDb pages. So, where did this notion that this is what it was trying to be come from? Well, it all ties back to this LA Times interview with executive producer for the show, Nick Jennings, wherein he discusses this episode in particular as far as it relates to ideas of gender fluidity and gender norms, saying that, basically, when it starts out, he is a pony, but he wants to be a unicorn. He has to go through a transformation to become a unicorn, and this asks the question of, what are you on the inside? What are you on the outside? how do you identify yourself? How do people see you? There's a lot of subtext in that. So this whole thing is literally part of their attempt to cover more complex themes and messages with an approach that tries to make them more palatable or understandable for children to get thinking about those sort of things. Donnie the Unicorn is about getting kids to try and think about this idea of presentation, about this idea of how they feel on the inside, and how that might impact the identity that they have, or change that in regards to what people have told them they are or perceive them as. It is sort of a trans message, whether that message is in the denial of established gender expressions, or in the concept of an internal sense of self, but while that might answer the intention of how they try to spin the episode, what I've also discovered is that they never intended to be that when they first wrote it. This was like forced on them to try and get a trans episode in there. It wasn't what they wanted to do. A fact that I think does play into the far trickier and more difficult to achieve question of, was this actually a good trans episode? Was this actually a lesson that kids should be watching and taking stuff away from? And personally, I don't really know if it is. With actually comparing this to the trans community and to trans identity, the holes in the narrative become far more evident and much more damaging. So let's start breaking down Donnie the Bloody Unicorn and how he relates to a trans person.
It's definitely not a unicorn, it's just... sad.
One of the big standout problems that I have with this is the inconsistency of how we're meant to relate to Donnie. Firstly, we're supposed to think of him as this character who is a horse but wants to be a unicorn, and the only person who believes in him is Bubbles. That belief leads him astray somewhat and turns him into a monster, and it's only through his symbolic death by falling off a tall building that he ends up transforming back into a horse, and we find out as well that he's also been a unicorn the whole time.
What is that, is it? It's a horn! Oh, Donnie, I'm so happy for you!
If that's a trans storyline, I can see that a big part of it is the notion that chasing this idea of what you should be, i.e. that a unicorn should have a horn and that Donnie doesn't, is ultimately toxic. And that what you should learn is that you were a unicorn the whole time, inside you. Though Donnie is dismissive of that idea, and only comes round when we see that he was literally, biologically, externally, a unicorn all along. The end of the episode is not about what's inside you, it's about what's on the outside. Realistically, it would have been a better narrative to the point that they're trying to make, to have Donnie become a unicorn through the power of his belief in himself, and the trial of self-identity that he went through in this episode. Not some cheap parent reveal that ruins any sort of development by showing that it was just genetic inheritance.
Mom? What are you doing hanging out with a bunch of unicorns?
I mean, you probably could have figured it out sooner if you'd ever cut that hair of yours.
Alongside that, we also have the absolutely strange way that the episode decided to approach the medical scientific stuff. Like the device designed by the Doctor almost seems as if it was the allegory for such a thing. A man in a lab suit made it up, it promises to give you the changes you want to achieve the body you have in mind, and you just sign a bunch of consent forms to get it done. But the episode presents it as this bad choice that Donnie is able to just hand-wave his way through with zero parental supervision and get this life-altering surgery that negatively impacts his life and then he can't go back from without literally dying and being saved by magical unicorns. That message would appear to be on the same side of the argument and debate as the right-wing conservatives and TERFs who spread misinformation about children being pushed into gender assignment surgeries that they can't go back from, and it destroying their lives, and meaning that when they detransition they are stuck with the ramifications of evil modern SJW medicine.
Turn him into a unicorn using the transmogrifying ray I just happened to finish this afternoon.
Oh no, what have I done?
And that whole point also kind of feeds into the he was a unicorn all along thing, because he transitions into a monster and then detransitions back into what he was regardless. Because he was always a unicorn, remember, he just didn't know it. And like, physically, literally, biologically, essentially a unicorn too, in this example, not like in his heart he was a unicorn. And that his transformed self was a monster that freaked people out and led to him acting like a monster. From a gender politics standpoint and trying to get this as a transgender theme, I don't get what the message is meant to be there, but it doesn't feel positive. It manages to do a bunch of things and stick no landings at all, really. Finally, as a quick aside to this, Bubbles is a really terrible ally. She uses Donnie and his transition exactly like how the TERFs think it occurs, pressuring him into it so that she can feel cool because she knows a trans person, a unicorn.
And I'll be friends with a real live unicorn.
Yeah!
And everyone will see how wrong they were.
And the episode acts as if both parties in that were somewhat to blame at the end. When no, Donnie clearly trusted Bubbles completely for some fucking reason, and Bubbles abused that trust to go straight for the surgery, despite the fact that the professor is the most untrustworthy scientist on the whole fucking planet to put your supposed friend's life in the hands of. I get that Bubbles is also a child, and expecting her to make that judgment call of her parental figure is probably not the right thing to do. This 2016 series was, after all, dedicated to showing the Powerpuff Girls stand on their own, fight their own problems, and be more decisive / involved. So to have her fail in that friend role and then kinda get forgiven for it without a real conclusion of how terrible that decision was is a bit of an odd way to teach that lesson about peer pressure. And before we end this, I am legally obliged to mention him at some point in this video, or the stands of the Powerpuff Girls will accuse me of failing to consider all the options. So let's think about him then.
So sinister, so horribly vile, that even the utterance of his name strikes fear into the hearts of men.
Yes, he does engage in some cross-dressing and gender presentations that board on the gender fluid and gender fucky. But he's also a devil, a non-human character that represents the concept of evil. While I'm certain that people might find that as inspiring for their own gender realization and identity, and that is a fact that I cannot take away from you, and nor would I want to. Your own trans media journey is your own after all. I don't really have much to say on this front, because it doesn't necessarily relate to anything more deep than that villains were quite able to be super queer thanks to much older restrictive laws / codes in Hollywood, and that had long-term ramifications on creating this stereotype that future shows would play with.
Wait, come back! I'll make my flapjacks cheaper!
And so...
And beyond that, a non-human character is often allowed to break binaries and molds that we assign to humans more freely without criticism because it feels more removed from our own perspectives and our own lives. Cis people don't feel as threatened by seeing a devil do cross-dressing or a devil be gender fucky compared to seeing a human who's presented just like them do the same thing. That's all I've kinda got to say there. I'm sorry if you wanted more stuff about him, but, I don't know, comment and I'll do a future video if I need to. So, that's the Powerpuff Girls episode. And ultimately, it was a bit of a flawed attempt to incorporate gender fluidity and trans narratives into a kid's show. Others around the same time period and in the future did a lot better with similar themes. I don't think that the Powerpuff Girls really ended up having the same long-term impact on the genre that its contemporaries did. It seemed as if they had the idea of what they wanted to get across, but didn't really consider the ramifications or the actual message of the metaphor that they adopted. And oftentimes I'm opposed to the idea that we need to sugarcoat this narrative for kids anyway. If you want to put in a trans story for your children's series, put in a trans character and have it be more literal. It avoids pitfalls like the Powerpuff Girls fell into, and just having a trans person doesn't mean that a show is inherently adult, something that we need to be more comfortable showing / engaging with. If you like what I said here, or like how I said it, or just need instruction on what to do with your life, then you should like, share, subscribe and comment. All the things that help me show YouTube that I'm a real content creator, no matter how much they might like to pretend sometimes that I'm not. If you really, really like what I've done, then you can help me come up with a fandom name. Because so far, all I have is basing it off the name of the channel, which led me to thinking of simps. I mean, I can call you all simps if you want, but I reckon that is already tied up in something else entirely. Other than that, if you want to help me out, the best way to do that is Patreon, Ko-Fi, or right here as a member on YouTube. All of which are great ways to provide me financial aid that is often a struggle to get consistently from the site that benefits from my views and ad time. Seriously, the Patreon number really does help because it allows me to plan my income better, and it would be ideal for it to cover all the stuff like rent, food, internet and power, which it currently is not exactly fully doing. Alternatively, we could give me free housing, and food, and power, but that seems less likely. Anyway, those in the $5 and up category are scrolling past the screen right now, and I really, really do appreciate everyone on there for helping to keep me alive. It means a lot to see that, and to see that sort of encouragement of what I'm doing this channel. A channel that I'm really hoping I can keep going for as long as I need to cover every trans episode or movie. So, you know, decades. Other than all of that, thank you for watching the video, and I hope you have a great day.